it's been one thing to manage the Fed. It's not been easy, I'm not saying, when we were loosening monetary policy, supporting the economy. How difficult will it be if and when Jay Powell gets confirmed as the next chair to really have a very different regime?
Well, David, it's true. For the first time, really, in about 40 years, inflation is the part of the dual mandate that's front and center, if not standing alone, at least much more prominent than it has been. And essentially, what they're confronting here is they've had, of course, a major supply side shock in the form of the virus, of uncertain duration, with literal variants that keep mucking up people's efforts to analyze when the effects will pass through. At the same time, they've had an awful lot of fiscal stimulus over the last couple of years. And so when you have reduced supply and increased demand, predictably, you've got inflation of a sort that we haven't seen in some time. Now, the Fed spent most of 2020 telling itself and us that they thought that inflation was going to be transitory because it was grounded in those supply side effects, people not going to work, not being able to get things around the country and the like. Obviously, they're not holding to that line anymore. And the implicit policy implication of their view last year that they didn't really need to do much has now obviously been abandoned. But they now need a new hypothesis as to the trajectory of inflation, what will cause it to perhaps recede, what will cause it to embed itself. And that's really, I think, the first order of business on monetary policy for the Fed this year.
Do they have, as far as you can tell, a theory of the case at this point? What are they managing this for? As they say, we have to get inflation down. We heard that from both Fed Chair Jay Powell as well as Larry Brainerd this week. They agree on the goal, but do they have a theory about how to come about with that goal?
Well, they have. I wouldn't have expected that at confirmation hearings they would have put forth a more or less nuanced monetary policy view. So I don't know what their operating theory is now, but it's surely not just going to be last year's. I mean, there are several options, right? They tend to talk about expectations a lot. That is, well-grounded inflation expectations in the public and markets, keeping inflation down. That's a hard one to judge in real time, and nobody really quite understands why expectations change. They could dust off a lot of the tools from the 80s, the output gap analysis, Phillips curve, the relationship between inflation and unemployment, wage price cycles, and try to apply that right now. Or they could come up really with transitory version 2, which would basically say, look, we think the medium-term or longer-term disinflationary forces in the economy, globalization, demographics, and the like, are still at work. And so we don't need to make major adjustments in monetary policy, but we do need to make some. So those are at least 3 possibilities or some combination of them. But I haven't seen anything yet that would give us a hint as to which particular blend of those notions the Fed is going to adopt. What's important, David, though, is that they do articulate, as you put it, a theory of the case so that they can then judge incoming data against that theory, and that allows them to make policy adjustments as appropriate.
Everyone is concerned, I think, first and foremost about what was called a policy error, policy mistake at this point. I saw some analysis done at Bloomberg, actually, that there's been 11 times since 1914 that the CPI has been over 5%, and in 8 of those instances, a recession occurred afterwards, and the 3 when it didn't, we had 2 wars and a depression going on. What would be the riskiest thing to take us toward a policy error in terms of formulating a theory of the case?
Well, the problem is they've got risks on both ends. That is part of the explanation for the historical observation you just made is the Fed will sometimes hit the brakes extremely hard and thereby cause a recession. Engineering the proverbial soft landing is not an easy thing to do. On the other hand, as we saw in the 70s, where the instinct may be just to tap the brakes a little bit, and it turns out there's a lot more inflation momentum, then you get into a situation in which inflation truly does become embedded in the economy. And that leads you to the Volcker like approach, which was really, really very difficult medicine to swallow indeed.
Dan, we saw someone you know well, Jay Powell, the current chair, and it looks like future chair as well of the Fed, testify this week. I wonder, as an institutional matter, what the challenges are that he may be facing, because the Fed is really coming under a lot of scrutiny right now, and there also is going to be a fair amount of turnover. There are quite a few new people who will come on board. What are the challenges for the chair in that world?
So it's good, a very good question, David. And it comes, at a complicated time because, as we were just discussing, monetary policy is not going to be an easy mission for the next 12 to 24 months. Essentially, the Fed is no stranger to attacks from the public, from members of Congress, even from administrations. But when that happens, the chair has historically needed to spend a good deal of time addressing those attacks or those challenges or those concerns, both in the public eye, but also, where appropriate, taking steps internally. And so, for example, right now, with all the questions around the trading of 3 members of the FOMC, which led to their resignations, obviously, that's something that the chair needs to address, and he needs to do it in a way that convinces the public. At the same time, as you say, he's got another institutional challenge, which is 3 new members of the board coming on, each of whom is going to want to carve out his or her role. It's not an easy thing at the Fed because there are really only 3 jobs that are well defined: the 2 vice chairs and the chair. And so, as I saw Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen do, they need to work with each governor to give that governor a role that allows him or her to channel their interests while at the same time doing it in a way that helps the board. And, David, a real risk would be if the board is kind of fractious publicly. There are, contrary to a lot of public views of some commentators, there's a lot of disagreement on the board a lot of the time. But most of the time that gets hashed out on the governor's card at lunch. And then the board makes a real effort to try to give a coherent view of what their agreed position is, because communication is such an important part of monetary policy. If you don't have that situation, it's one thing for a Reserve Bank president or two to be off with a different message. That happens all the time. It's not a problem. But if you have members of the board dissenting either technically at FOMC meetings or effectively through their public statements, that just makes monetary policy all the much harder to effectuate.